never mind. There you go. He said he was here. Mr. Peterson.
Pete Peterson.
John Wellington.
Dick Training.
Section 1 Hoff.
Eric Croft. And Ms. LaFrance and Mr. Dunbar we're here. I'm sure they'll be right back, but they are not here right now. So for the members, 2019, and I've talked about this issue. Mr. Dunbar is here now. When I first got on 3 years ago, the clerk's office raised in our orientation a concern about how late on the table items was sometimes used. Sometimes, very appropriately, late on the table items is additional information on a published agenda item that has come through. Community council saying we agree or don't agree or love it. Additional things. Sometimes it's entirely new, usually S versions. Sometimes other aspects that go on our agenda. Sometimes resolutions, and it's not only difficult for them to do over the weekend and on Monday, it has the potential of affecting the public process because it wasn't on our addendum that is published on a Friday, and people wouldn't have any way of knowing until really Monday or Tuesday that this was going to happen. So it spurred a discussion with the clerk's office, with me and to some extent Forrest, and then later Felix and Mr. Gates about, do we want to relook at our processes there? And again, with the double goal of having it flexible enough that we can do our business and get things before us that we need to, but respecting the public process and that something that is laid on the table is often a surprise to the public when they hit the Tuesday night meeting. There are also legal limits to it. So I don't think we hit it very often, but there's a series of cases in Alaska. For those interested, a City of Dillingham case in 2001, a Bristol Bay Borough case in 1978, and an Anchorage case actually in 1973 about these issues. And essentially the idea is, what if you radically change in an S version? So you publicly notice the first time it's a bill about this, and then an S version comes without any notice, and you've had public hearing on it. An S version comes that totally changes what it is, and you just pass it. And what the courts have said, it's a pretty, it has a fairly liberal allowance for amendments, but at some point, if you've changed, and the language the court uses, our prior cases establish that if an ordinance is amended after the initial public hearing, only those changes to an ordinance which are so substantial as to change its basic character require the public hearing process be repeated. There is a point where the S version or the multiple amendments can make it so extremely changed that we have to reopen public hearing. As I said, though, that's a pretty fundamentally changed the character, and in all these cases they rejected challenges on that. So there was a fish tax in Dillingham, and they changed the amount, and they changed the who collected the tax, and the court said the people had knowledge that a fish tax was up, and that was enough. I don't know why Dillingham and the Bristol Bay area has such a hot spot in this area, but they had a sales tax in Dillingham. It was the Bristol Bay case that had the raw fish tax, and then in Anchorage it was raising the mayor's salary from $6,000 to $24,000 back then, which somebody took offense at.
Go back to that.
Yeah, okay, we can consider that. But they said changing that number didn't change the total character of what you were looking at. People had enough of a notice. So it took a lot longer to work on it than I thought. But what I wanted to put before the assembly, and this is just going to be up for introduction on Tuesday, so we'll have time. I wanted a work session just though, so you guys could get it and digest it and think about the issues involved. It also it does that. It says essentially, if what we're doing, and I set a slightly different standard than this extreme fundamentally change the character. That's what we can't do, run up against a wall. But what we want to do, I think, is to say something a little bit shorter. If what we've done has changed a lot of things so that the public notice isn't really adequate, we really should hold another public hearing unless it's an emergency ordinance and there's some good reason. And so the heart, I think, of the matter. Now, one more thing. The charter says a member may introduce with 3 votes. And so I didn't want to, but haven't in this, restricted your right to, at any time, with no advance notice, drop a thing. Now, you still need to get 2 other people to agree with you, but you have that right. So be better if it were on the agenda, but I think you have the constitutional, if you will, right on a Tuesday night to say, nobody's heard of this, but here's my ordinance, and if you get 2 members, then that is introduced. The real danger, I think, isn't so much that, because the introduction doesn't trigger much. There's still going to be a public hearing, so even if that's a surprise to the public, they're going to have 7 days, which is in state statute, and we follow it in code. I think it's 5 days of state statute. Anyway, we cover as much as is required. The real danger is something that has been noticed now is totally changed, and the public hearing didn't really address what it was. Mr. Trainee?
Eric, do you send a copy of this to administration? Because in many cases, they're the ones that lay something on the table. So we need to have their input into this. And I'd like it before the public hearing, if we get their response to it.
Yeah, well, we've worked with them sort of originally, and then we sort of went on our own track. But that you're right. That's where a lot of the ARs on money come from. It's pretty rare that somebody is dropping. Well, it does happen. Occasionally there's these ordinances.
I've worked with Albury Mayor since Tom Fick. I'm telling you, it's not that rare, sir.
Okay, there you go.
Depends on the mayor.
That's right. And so this says you can, skipping sort of to page 3, because, the changes on the agenda we had are simply clearing a place for quasi-judicial. I haven't written the quasi-judicial rules, but we've all discussed the fact that we operate differently when we're talking as legislators, essentially, than when we're talking as judges. We've never divided it up on our agenda. Yeah, so go in order. Sorry, I was skipping around. 2030-035 simply makes a couple of changes to the agenda to accommodate a new section that allows, that is quasi-judicial. So 10 will now be municipal licenses or other quasi-judicial business on the consent agenda. And later we pull out quasi-judicial into 15. So essentially 9 had quasi-judicial and ordinary legislation mixed together in consent agenda, and later 14 had new public hearings mixed together, ordinances and quasi-judicial. I've just twice separated them out so that we start to think of them differently. Mr. Webberton, Mr. Dunbar.
Okay, so we would essentially do 2 consent agendas and go through the normal thing and say, okay, with anything like a poll, it's what it could be from either one. But then you would say we approve, the number 9s with regular business, and then we go again, consent agenda.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted it out to you guys. Yeah, so that's doubling our time. But whatever can help us think of these very different things in very different ways and know that you put a different hat on. The example I like to use is, when we're doing normal legislative business than me walking around a marijuana shop and trying to smell it and seeing the blah, or talking to people, how's it going? That's perfectly legitimate legislative. In fact, it's being a good assembly member. On quasi-judicial, it can be problematic or even wrong, right? Because you're supposed to hear the evidence. So we really have 2 very different standards, and we need to start thinking, I think, about, am I doing this? Am I acting as a judge, or am I acting as a legislator? I had Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Trainee.
So my question's on the next page. Are there more questions on the quasi-judicial?
You still on quasi-judicial? So Mr. Trainee and Mr. Webberton.
Just we need to make sure sitting members, new ones and old ones, get trained in quasi-judicial.
Yeah.
Because the process is completely different.
And guys,
89, one of the persons did quasi-judicial on the issue of West Anchorage, and we did that a couple nights, and it's interesting the process you have to go through.
I tried to get a draft of that before I left, and it really is more complicated than I thought. Whether you want to set up a kind of board of equalization type thing that handles those, whether you want to have subcommittees that handles those, whether we just want to understand that we have different rules and clarify it, just became, that's something you're going to have to do. All I've really done here is say you ought to treat them differently. Ms. Quinn Davidson, and then back to Mr. Webb.
I was just going to quickly speak to what Mr. Trainee suggested. Barbara, I had contacted Eric and Barbara about trying to do more assembly training on issues that we all see a lot, but maybe don't come with background. We all have different things we know about. We don't all know about everything. Of course, with the exception of but I think that...
So I'll shut up then.
No, I think it's a really good idea to have training on things like quasi-judicial, as you brought up. Land use, sort of how does the land use 2040 plan guide our decisions, those sorts of things. Anyway, so if people have ideas, give them to me and Barbara, because we're trying to come up with ideas for training that we can implement once we have the new members on board.
Can I go to that training even though I'll be gone?
Of course.
You're always invited.
Yeah.
Once an assembly member, always an assembly
Gene will be
member.
there, okay? Public meeting, so.
So we're staying on the
Yeah,
agenda
sorry,
for
I'll
now.
talk about
Mr. Weddleton on the agenda. You want in as well on that?
It
Yeah.
might be actually, I guess, piggyback on Austin's point is coming from the planning commission, rezones are quasi-judicial. We couldn't go talk to the applicants or anything, and couldn't visit the site. But as assembly members, we totally can. We can talk to them and stuff. So I think a clear definition, it's different then. Training there is very, very different from what we do here on the assembly. And I'd like to get a much cleaner line. And I check with the legal staff and talk to people about it. I just like to know.
We get to,
And I
in
don't
some
think
sense,
that affects this so much, though.
I asked Natalie to just hand out what it looks like now, so you can. This is so involved that it's hard to. So that's what it is now. Coming back, we get to some extent define our rules with certain constitutional or other limits. Did you want to, Mr. Dunbar, as well?
No, I was going to comment on that. So I believe it's a state statute that says that the reason it's legislative is not quasi-judicial for us on the rezones. But we were reached out to about a variance, and I spoke with our attorney about that. And I go, no, on that, you're quasi-judicial. And so,
Right, and so, right, that's a weird decision. We went through, we worked on that. I think it's decisional, but anyway, whatever it is, there seems to be a state law that says, well, a lot of states say rezones are quasi-judicial. We don't. But it really feels like it to me, and it feels like I'm acting as a judge, not acting as a legislator. So we could say, hey, I know we don't have to, but we're going to treat all these in this way. We can make our rules as long as they're don't violate the Constitution. We can make them a little more respectful of the public process. I have Pete, Dick, and Fred. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question is, it says municipal licenses. Are we talking marijuana and liquor licenses in that section?
The most common quasi-judicial would be marijuana and liquor, the one that we would get a lot. But when we started going through it, Deidre, Dean, all of us, there's a fair amount of them. And of weird types. Taxi licenses used to be, so there are, the main distinction, right, is, are you creating a new general public set of rules, or are you applying a set of facts to rules you've already made? That second is acting like a judge. I know the rule, what are the facts, I'm seeing whether I yank your valuable permit, don't give you a thing, say you're in violation of a thing, versus writing the rules for everybody anew or renewing them. And you just have we have a lot that we can do, almost no limits as legislators in listening or thinking or hearing whatever we want to hear to do that. But if I'm judging Mr. Dyson's business license, I really do need to respect his right to present his stuff, the evidence to be presented, and I have certain standards on how I can't just say, I'm yanking it because I don't like him. I need to it fits category 3, and that's why I'm yanking it, so people can know. Mr. Train.
Just if you're at a community council meeting and they decide they want to appeal a decision to the assembly, it's in your best interest to walk out of the meeting.
Right.
Don't get condemned by staying there. Do not vote on it if you're a member of that community council. Because from the moment they decide they want to protest at the assembly, you're then acting as a judge on the assembly.
And that's a real good example of the trap, like the switch going off. we're sitting there listening, and we're perfectly fine. In fact, we're good to be there. And now they're saying, you're about to act as a judge, because we just said, and so we've all kind of learned that, but it's an example of when we switched roles all of a sudden, and we need to say, wait, then now it's different. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, that might be slightly out of order. I really appreciate you bringing this up, just like I appreciate what you do in the taxi cab. Principles are courageous. But this is needed. So my first night of this time on the assembly, we were about to amend something that was very important to a specific vendor. You know, and I said, wait a minute, let's hear from these guys and see what it does to them. And I called a timeout, went and talked to the guys, you know, and they said, I haven't seen this before, but it looks okay. But we want, when we're going to have to make a judgment about whether we're substantially changing the content and impact of something on the floor, you know, either with an AI or an amendment and so on. And I like the wording, but it still calls for a judgment. And I would suggest that we add to this, if we're about to amend something or deal with a substitute that hasn't had, you know, it's an argument, is it substantive or just nibble on the edges, that we have a deal with if any assembly member challenges the right to go ahead and adopt the AI or the amendment, then it takes a super majority of us to go forward and overrule that.
Okay, good.
I think that's a good idea. I know it's maybe not the best way to accomplish that.
Well, and it's some version. Well, it is really what we did here. But I know you just got handed this or recently handed it. So now we're moving on to quasi-judicial. We've separated it out in the agenda. We haven't really resolved what our rules are, what the procedures are. So sorry to leave you with that. But we'll at least have the start of the discussion being this is different. Now we're going to tell you. We're going to flesh out how we handle it differently. So that's the first part. The second part is really talking about, and so we're starting now on.
Section 2.
Yeah. So publication and distribution of the agenda. You know, the ordinances that we've had two different timelines for when things had to be out to the public. 36 and 72 hours of notice. And really there's two different things, right? There is when the public gets to know what you're doing. That's usually by the title of the agenda. So we give them the agenda in a public manner, and the titles tell them what we're going to be considering. And then by Friday, we get the texts of things out and an addendum to the agenda, so more titles. Titles are the way we give notice to the public. So we started with the principle that all of this is public information. We have no right to keep it, the text of. And we're going to tell you, and that's C1 at the bottom of page 2. The text of all agenda items, and except those that are for executive session, shall be public. That was understood to be true, but is stated to be true. And then we say in 2 on the top of page 3, the agenda shall be published to the public, and the text of all agenda items shall be distributed no later than midnight on the Friday before a regular Tuesday meeting, not less than 48 hours for any other regular meeting. We'd had this weird 72 and 36. We just said, look, our standard practice and what we'd like is, if it's a regular meeting, and it conforms really to what we do. By Friday, two things are going to happen. The public is going to have the title of everything we're going to consider, and we and the mayor are going to have the text of everything. Getting the text out to everybody is more difficult, but they will have that by the meeting. So public by Friday will have, I know what's going to be considered by its title, and the members and the mayor will have the text of the thing. And if it's a special meeting, that is, it's not a Tuesday meeting, then you're going to meet a 48-hour rule. They'll have 2 days. So it standardized those. And the assembly may consider only matters you can introduce by, if you haven't done that, we're not going to talk about it unless it's an emergency. And you'll see there on page 3, Mr. Dyson, affirmative vote of at least 8 members. So if you're going to bring something up, it better have a good reason. You say there's a good reason, you need kind of a supermajority, or we'll just hold it over. So that's in there. And then I say something that we have understood in the middle of 3, and then I'll stop for questions. But so subsection 4 in the middle of page 3, supplemental materials on a matter that has been included on a properly published and distributed agenda may be added to the agenda as handouts any time. In other words, I mean real new items, not a new community council thing on a duly noticed item, a new letter of support or opposition. So things that simply supplement something the public had notice of, you can do whenever you want. I lost track of it, but I think Mr. Weddleton first, and then Ms. Quinn Davidson, Mr. Dunbar. Yeah.
So I imagine you address that. I just don't quite see. So when you say is regular assembly meeting, does that mean Tuesday meetings? Because you got rid of regular in 1, and I think that makes sense. You're just saying any of our stuff
Is public, yeah.
Then in 2, regular.
Yeah, let's work.
Regular Tuesday meeting. Then continuing that sentence, you just go other regular assembly meetings. So what is a regular assembly meeting? What is a work session? What is a committee meeting?
Dean and I went back and forth on that. I think the regular should be out of the other. So I think it should say, the agenda shall be published to the public, and the text of all agenda items, not confidential or privileged, shall be distributed to each assembly member and the mayor no later than Monday on the Friday before a regular Tuesday meeting, more than midnight, sorry, and not less than 48 hours prior to any other assembly meeting. So it's a general standard for the Tuesday meeting of a Friday, and if we have special Thursday or other meetings, weird meetings, it's a 2-day rule.
So get rid of that regular.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so does that mean assembly meetings, committee meetings, and work sessions? This is an assembly meeting?
2 days? I did not consider that, so you guys might.
And I think that should work. 36 hours, look at that.
Think about that, whether you want to include committees and work sessions. I'll come back. I have Ms. Quinn Davidson and Mr. Dunbar. Who did I miss?
Thanks, Eric. So under this, you could allow amendments that relate to the matter that's already been noticed, right? But you couldn't allow things to be laid on the table that are new. You couldn't allow any new matter. And then we'll deal with how we handle amendments and S versions later. So this says any issue has to either be on the Friday thing or have a good reason for not being on the Friday thing, so the public can know, on the Friday addendum. So it must be published to the public and distributed to the members. 2 different requirements, right? The public gets to know the title and we get to know the full text. And if you didn't meet that, we're not going to consider it unless it's emergency. But I don't mean things that relate to it. And then we have this afterwards review of, did I change it so much? I think members probably have the right, though the charter doesn't speak to it explicitly, to offer an amendment that you just think of. Like, I don't think I can say everybody has to have their amendments by Friday. I'd like to, the clerk's office would really like to, but I don't think I can handcuff you that way. The downside is, and you'll see it later, you can tell me, hey, I have an amendment on Friday, and that can be published with the agenda, and then the public gets to know it. The benefit of that is, if it passes, it's not going to hold it over anymore. If you just write something big and substantive the night of, it may mean that at the end of the day we say, well, you pretty much changed it, haven't you? We're going to hold it over. So, I'm not sure I answered your question. Can you? Yeah, I think you said, yes, would have been the answer, but I think you said it.
Give it to me one more time. Sorry.
Your version of it.
Yeah, I have another question too, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So when, and maybe it's addressed later in this, I skimmed it this morning, but haven't absorbed it all. When is the deadline for getting the text to the public?
Yeah, so we set those as the same deadline. So by Friday midnight, or 2 days for any other meeting, you have, when's the text? Sorry, I was going down a different path. We say it is public, so we have no right to withhold it, but I didn't put an exact, like the Monday before or whatever. Yeah, you might say by 24 hours before the meeting. It's not in here. title gives them notice, and I guess in its extreme, you say, you knew I was going to be talking about fish stuff, show up, and here's the thing Tuesday night. It does not have a requirement of text to public. It has title to public and text to members.
And is that, can I ask you?
Yeah.
Is that because in process, we normally post all of the text items we have by Monday anyway? And if so, is there any reason not to require that?
Certainly a reason to consider it. We did, and we were doing so many other things, I
Yeah.
didn't add a moving part, but you could certainly add that idea. Shall be available at the meeting is the weakest. Shall be available 24 hours before.
Because it doesn't seem that there's any disadvantage for having it available in advance because we already have it. And any changes could be presented up to the meeting because they're related. So I don't see a disadvantage in requiring that
I
they're
agree.
available to the public.
Okay, well
It's
you guys...
electronic, put it on the web.
Yeah.
You guys are going further, and that's fine. At each step, we got to make sure. Like normally, we do that. Is there some reason that at some point
Right.
this will trap us? When we publish the addendum, it is embedded, right? So does the public have on the Friday addendum both the title and the text?
So I'm looking online right now.
Should have just the title, Erica,
agenda.
not the text.
Okay.
I know someone who would know.
Yeah. So Barbara is at the election center, but let's think about that as we may add and you'll have the text by. Certainly
Find out in a minute.
the public should have the title and we should have the text by a certain time, and the public should have the text soon. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. Three things I think are pretty quick. And I apologize if Mr. Weddleton had mentioned this. I was distracted there for a little bit. In two, the agenda and the addendum, right? I'm wondering if we should add language in there, something like with addendum items or something like that. So people understand that there is an agenda and an addendum. Addendum is in some way illegitimate. So just a suggestion to add some language that references the addendum specifically. Number three, I'm thinking about the actual effect of this. So I think it is relatively uncommon for someone to lay an ordinance on the table. And at any rate, it doesn't matter because it matters less because it's just being introduced. But the things that are often laid on the table are, one, we tend to lay resolutions on the table that we just finally get done on Monday, honoring so-and-so, right? And just to be clear, as I read this, this would ban that. You would not be able to lay that kind of resolution. And I'm fine with that. During my time as chair, I often railed on how many things got added last minute. But am I misinterpreting that? That is the case.
So let's address that real quick. So Section 3 talks about resolutions. But this could be clear on ordinances. But so on resolutions, we distinguish between resolutions.
Sorry, there's subsection 3. I'm looking at subsection 3. So
Yeah,
subsection 3
yeah, but
ordinances?
it's still a good point because I don't know that we really were crystal clear that we mean ordinances here.
Okay.
And the reason we didn't, well, it still made some language. We distinguished in 3 between ordinances or resolutions, requiring public hearing and those that don't. Because we use resolution in at least two very different ways. For approving appropriations, sometimes we had some examples where they have real impacts, as opposed to honoring. So we say other resolutions not requiring a public hearing may be introduced and amended without the need. So we just say do what you want on resolutions that are of the non-public hearing type.
Well, it said without the need for additional public testimony. But that to me seems unrelated to the subsection 3 on page 3 language. It says we can't, as an assembly, consider these things if they were introduced after Friday.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'd said ordinance for a while, and we got in this. It's not just ordinance because there are ARs that actually are important.
Sure.
And so I don't know that this is as clear as it should be to make that distinction.
Well,
We tried
so
to.
I'm fine with the resolutions that declare National Puffer Fish Day or whatever it is, but the administration sometimes has a late breaking. We need to spend $70,000 to fix this thing, and we're putting it on the table on Monday. And I don't think it's an emergency in the way that we think of it as emergencies, but it's still pretty important to the functioning of the city. And it doesn't require public testimony, so it doesn't really touch on this large section 3. But if we aren't allowed to take it up, then we're stymied by subsection 3 here.
Yeah, Mr. Sheehan.
Thank you for that point. Typically, any sort of appropriation, emergency financial appropriation, is tied to the timing of getting And I think the word emergency may be a little too strong to say it's an emergency, but in essence, if we don't receive the appropriation, then the Volvo tractors we're about to buy are no longer available. So
Or could create an emergency.
could create an emergency. So to your first point. To your second point, though, about the puffer fish, which we're all in favor of. The clause in here about action on a matter essential to be meaningful and cannot be delayed. If there are resolutions that for pufferfish, like this is National Pufferfish Week, I would say that clause gives you the out, because if you don't approve it this week, then it's meaningless.
Okay, so what I think we meant, and then now, but I really tried to. We got stuck on some of these questions just with Dean and Barbara and Lisa, and so I finally said, let's get this out to the assembly. Like, we've done enough, because I don't know the answer to that, but we don't have to be wrapped around until we let the assembly get wrapped around this. So pushed it out with some of those still nascent. But I would say, Mr. Dunbar, that we meant, and we can clarify, I don't have any restrictions on Pufferfish Day. Do that when you want, honor people as a surprise. That is just not the core of what we're talking about here. And the resolutions that require public hearing, and they're scattered all through the code, that do various things that have real impacts, I want in these requirements. So you would then be back saying, oh, it's pufferfish, that doesn't apply. But ordinances and resolutions that have a force of law or make some impact, you're going to actually have to say, does it have a financial, such as financial emergencies, and I think those natural disasters, or when immediate assembly action on matters essential to be meaningful and cannot be delayed. I think the Caterpillar appropriation is more that. This doesn't have any. If you do this, it takes all its meaning away. But again, we can change that language if that's what it's meant to say. I need to do this quick, but sort of set the presumption up as you better get your stuff in early or have a real good reason for not.
But that's already supposed to be our norm.
Yeah, and we hadn't really said it though, and we'd been gotten.
I certainly said it.
Okay, we hadn't said it in ordinance. You're right. We've said it to each other, and laid on the table is this weird thing where it has this mishmash of who cares, pufferfish, community council letter, and whole new thing. Not to mean that we don't care about the community council, but the community council letter saying I oppose and oppose isn't as important as not having none. Okay, so there's the issue on that. D is we hadn't really defined public notice. Oh yeah, go, Mr. Weddleton.
2 points. One is on 2. Distribute each assembly member to mayor no later than midnight on Friday. If we send something, I can't send it to all assembly members. I got something ready, so it means that means Monday because staff's not working weekend. So I think now you got to have it by noon. So I think you need to say to the clerks or something by noon.
Well, this is the obligation, and the clerk's taking direction from us. So this is to get out. We gave till midnight for when things bleed from 4 to 5 to 6. But I would think we expect them, and they regularly would be done in the afternoon of Friday. And you just couldn't, if there was a mistake, if people say, hey, that didn't work, if you added a thing, it could be no later than the midnight of Friday.
So they will tell us to meet this, I have to have it to them by noon.
Yeah,
right?
they'd set an internal rule that said you better get it to me, but yeah.
Okay, so, and then this is all about better notification of the public, and that's for that. So there has been some cases that you introduced something to lay it on the table, but it had the public hearing 2 meetings following, not 14 days. So now if I had waited 2 weeks, so I missed the cutoff, I don't introduce it until 2 weeks later. Now the public has 2 weeks to look at it. So I'm really doing better with the public by laying it on the table, giving them a month. And this would say, no, you can't do that.
You can always introduce a matter. So we didn't think we had the power. So 3B says you can introduce, you wrote it out at the meeting. If you get 2 votes, it's introduced.
You can't consider it, but you can introduce it.
Right, and so that would be covered then.
I think so, yeah. Write it out on a piece of paper. It's not the best process, but it is. I think you're right under the charter, so you do it. And it also doesn't have that much deleterious impact on public notice because it's going to be considered 2 weeks from now.
Also, you can set your own public hearing date. So if you, in your scenario, were forced to introduce it 2 weeks later, you can still say, well, I want the public hearing 4 weeks later.
But maybe there is, a second minute. Wait.
And then D. Mr. Dyson, did you want in, or it got answered?
Yeah, I wanted in.
Okay, go ahead.
Keep track of my thoughts. So, for me, often when I'm just looking at the agenda that shows up in my email box, the titles aren't enough for me to know whether I'm interested or not. Just quoting the AAR or the AO, numbers doesn't get it for me. So I just really like when the public is going through there to be able to click on one of those and get the data.
Let me ask, so does it give the text anyway, what we
So
do?
When you're actively pulling up the agenda for the upcoming meeting, and I can show you, it pulls up like your resolution AR 2019-80, and it has the whole title. You could click on it, and it'll pull up the associated documents.
Yeah. So that's what we want to do with the addendums at the earliest time we can, and the latest on the table things.
Okay, we're hitting a balance between, so then that simplifies too. You just say, you shall have the title and the text to me and the public, simply the mayor and the public, all by this date or by 2 days before, and if you don't, it better be an emergency.
Yeah, that's right. All right, second separate subject. I've just been reading through it, and I didn't see where what you put down here on the supermajority applied to the issue I raised. You lay an amendment on the table, or Jim went out during the hearing, and I think it's substantive, and you say it isn't, and the chair is going to rule whether it's substantive or not. I would like us to consider that if the chair says it's not substantive, I can say horse manure, I challenge that, and you've got to have a supermajority to sustain your ruling, and so on, because it is a judgment call, and I suspect most of our chairs will be very sensitive to that, and it'll be a valid judgment. But I want a challenge from any assembly member to call for a supermajority to overrule it.
Yeah. So you keep skipping us forward, but let's skip forward to page 5. Top of page 5. So it's at the end of some stuff that we'll get to, but the basic end on top of page 5 says, if the assembly chair determines that changes made to an ordinance during a meeting are so substantial as to change the basic character of the ordinance, the assembly shall postpone action on said date. And I meant there to be what you said, and so it should really say unless overturned or whatever by that many members. So here's the thing, and then it comes down. We played with, you got to have your amendments in by Friday.
Yep.
And I just thought, I can't hold that line.
Yep.
Like, I'd like to do that. I'd like to tell me and everybody, but the stuff so the carrot and stick of what we came up with, but you guys, it's in your hands now, is if you have your amendment by Friday or your S version, then that's public notice. It was out. And if it passes, the chair can't do you any harm. You can say, Mr. Chairman, we changed it a lot, but the public knew we might change it a lot because the S version was out on time. If you miss the Friday deadline, or you write it up at the time, you run the risk of it being delayed because the public didn't have that information.
Yep.
And that's what I meant by that last the stuff just before G. But it should have, and I didn't see till now that it didn't.
But I want it to be
Any member?
No, any member, but I want it to mean no matter what way the chairman rules.
Yeah.
If he says we're going to delay it, I want an assembly member to say I challenge the rule of the chair.
Right.
So on.
So it's really not a chair, it's a supermajority. But somebody's got to make that initial determination, right? Somebody has to say, we did a lot of stuff here.
Yep.
No, I don't think that. I think it was just minor stuff, or it was big.
Yep.
And
Any
then,
member.
and then, okay, let me think about that first. Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Weddleton, and then D.
I just I was going to bring this up before and I forgot to. And it might be the kind of problem that is impossible to write language to solve. But, looking at your definition of amendment, this definition of substantive version on the floor, I think we all have in our mind a conception of what an amendment is versus a substantive version. But the language you have written here, for example, substantially modifies the basic character, the intent, the content, the impact, or the intent of the underlying ordinance. I think that's written so broadly that you might actually end up having more things be substitute versions than you expect. Like, for example, you had an amendment to change the downtown tax rate from 12 years to 10 years. But let's say you had one to go from 12 years to 5 years. I would argue that's now a substitute version because you have fundamentally changed its impact. You've gone from this might be an effective tool to all the experts saying this is now an inner, piece of law. But most people, I think most citizens would think that's an amendment, not a real substitute version. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Lisa, to her credit, really did a lot of work on this and added that. I had sort of been thinking, hey, whatever you do at S's or amendments, at the very end, somebody's make a call like, is it a big change or not? Do we need more public hearing? But that's a good comment on that. Mr. Weddleton, D, Mr. Trainer.
I just wondered on Mr. Geisler's comment there. Is there already something in Robert's rules that here makes a ruling and then Robert's rule says here's what we can do?
Here's what it takes to overrule it.
Right.
I think it's just a majority to, well, I'll look at that. I don't know.
Is that in Robert's rule?
I don't know, but I had the same point. Why are you doing it by supermajority? To Mr. Dyson's.
Does Robert's rules address that?
I'll
The chair
look
makes
at
a
it for
ruling.
you.
Oh, you'll chat.
Do we go by Roberts or Mason?
We go by Roberts, and it's confusingly different than Mason's, yeah. D, did you have more?
No, just that, and then I also agree with that. The last comment over here was that there's a big gap between how minor is defined and how substantial is defined. There's an awful lot.
A lot of room in there. Mr. Trainee.
Just getting back to that again, you'll need to change the chair to 6 votes. So if there's no reason to need 8, because if you don't like the ruling, you change the ruling in the chair and you take the chairman out. I've done it twice. Now,
Just say aye and 5
because
other
I brought it
people.
forward. Anyway, have you put anything in here on dealing with only written amendments? No silly handwritten amendments. No one can read. I want the clerk's office to know, be able to tell us exactly what we're dealing with on the amendment. And many times people get chicken scratch something and say, okay, now give the clerk. I want it to be typewritten so you know exactly what it is.
What do you guys think of how inherent our power to amend a thing is? Even like it would be better for the clerk's office, it'd be better for the public if we said amendments got to be this way. But I think there's kind of this sense of I have the right to do a piss poor job on my amendment if I want and offer it.
On that subject,
Yeah, Mr. Peters.
When we're getting into the details of an ordinance at our meetings, sometimes an amendment comes to mind that makes sense. And so we may have to write it up by hand and send it over to Dean, and then they type it up quick and try to get it ready for us. But I don't think that should delay an ordinance for a couple of weeks.
Right.
Just because somebody actually said, "Oh, hey, that's a really good idea. Let's try this."
Dunbar and Weddleton, go
I
ahead.
just want to say really quickly to that too. I think that you have to have almost total ability to amend on the floor because we cannot actually amend. Unlike a lot of other legislative bodies, we can't amend in committee, right? We can't actually amend something. We can come back with a substitute version, but we can't do regular amendments. Like there's no multiple committees working on it. There's no conference
Committee
committee.
substitutes. There's
nothing like that. So we have to have ability to make the sausage on the floor, as ugly as it sometimes looks.
Mr. Weddleton, and then
I
Mr.
agree with that. I think it would be totally disrespectful to the public process to say you have to have it in your amendments before you have the public hearing. When we have a public hearing, they may have a great idea. And I say, why is it 10 feet from a playground equipment instead of 20 like every other distance? Okay, it's very simple. Change 10 to 20. Do I need to write that up? But I think you have to be freewheeling and be ready for it.
You brought before in the Ms. Kundevitz the tension sort of between public hearing that gives me that I do something in reaction to a public hearing. Oh, my amendment to 20, and then now we got to reopen it. I did it just because the public said, and so there's a chicken and egg thing a little bit. But I do think if you set the bar pretty high, did I so change this thing that now, and I don't know what the word quite is, but it's if you change the entire character by law, you have to. But I think we were going to set a little more better process than that, right? If you something, then we're going to delay it. Ms. Kundevitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is kind of meta, but what's the process by which we're going to move forward on this thing about process? Are you planning to bring it on Tuesday? I mean, we hear a lot of conversation. Are we going to work
It's
through
just being
this? Or?
used.
Yeah,
It's just being introduced, okay.
the meta thing was we had different versions. Dean left, and I almost had to lay this on the table, which would have been such a bad process to get it in before you guys that I'm like, Dean, just get it out. So that would have that would have been bad.
Mr. Haberman's head is in his hands.
So thought that was a bad way to start this, but it's just going to be introduced.
Okay.
And then we'll delay it over for the next one. So I wanted the work session before introduction for all this, for you guys to be thinking all the different ways you want it. Good.
I appreciate that.
Any other questions or Mr. Dice?
Well, it's axiomatic, but indeed, part of the genius of our system is, quote, ordinary citizens with very different training and experience bring that to the table. And the beauty is the diversity of our backgrounds and experiences. And there'll be time with somebody sitting there will say, do you realize what you're trying to do here invokes this? Or did you didn't realize what the times are across the shoal down here? I mean, we bring that kind of expertise and so on. And to preclude that from being introduced is weakens us. And I'm probably the head of Trainees fan club. But the idea of saying, I don't care how good an idea it is, Croft, you didn't go through the right thing, and it ain't typed.
Fred,
I
it
could
takes
use a
3
gesture.
minutes to give it to the clerk and her to put it on the computer, and then to run a copy out to you. We're not talking 2 hours. We're talking 10 to 20 minutes.
Leave it, Miss.
Having been at that position as a next assembly council, there are 6 or 7 emails coming to both of us at any given time and requests for amendments. It can be a nightmare when you have these active debates going on, but we can barely keep up with these. So I vote against the writing report. I mean, we do our very best, but it's really difficult.
And that's why it doesn't directly address yours, but that's why this took the approach of, I'm not telling you amendments have to be on Friday. I'm telling you there's a consequence if they're in. Because if you do it on Friday, you've let the public know, and it's just there's no basis for the public to say, I didn't know this might happen. If you want to write it out at the time, you run the risk of us delaying it further. And it seemed like that was the balance. But you guys will have the final call on that. Good. Think about it, chew on it. It'll just be introduced, and we'll have another work session. Ms. LaFrance.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going back to the 2 consent agendas, I was looking at our agenda on Tuesday for what typically falls under 10 regular agenda, and was just curious as to what the original thinking was behind having a section 10, because it seems like all these things we
You're a historian. You want to tell us, Ms. Traney? Sorry.
We typically cover under 9, and then with this proposed change and the second consent agenda containing municipal licenses or the quasi-judicial business, I mean, some of those are set for public hearing and would show up on first new business, right? So on the consent agenda I'm just wondering what would be on that. Liquor license renewals, but protests would go under new business, public hearing.
We've separated both. So consent agenda has 2 prongs now, 9 and 10, and new business has 2 prongs, 14 and 15. I have heard from Barbara, and Dick can tell us the history of it, but that 10 we don't really use anymore at all. And what used to happen is the consent agenda would move to 10. And they after a while thought it was just acted on, but it somehow 9 from consent became 10 from of new business, but then everything was held over till action anyway and became 14. So it's a
And that just quick follow up then.
Yeah.
And so for items like that, we close the public hearing, like the firefighters or the toxic flame retardants. If we cruise through the first part, right? We've had this before where we get to a big ticket item that's old business before 6 or 6:30, and I think the public is generally accustomed to, okay, we don't do big items until after 6 or so. I mean, that wouldn't necessarily change how we take up those things, because the chair could always say, we'll take our dinner break and pick that up later. I mean, I don't see, this wouldn't change necessarily how we handle old business.
No, but hopefully the discipline that comes with this is to say, now we're under old business, and you have one quasi-judicial and one other, and you say, now I'd like to remind everybody it's in 11, but this is a quasi-judicial matter, and we ought to be thinking that way, and then we just go ahead and do. I don't know whether you want to split up old business too, but maybe. Mr. Peterson.
Well, I see we're getting close to the end of the meeting, and we really didn't talk about D, public notice, on page 3.
Yeah, and D was just trying to codify what was already there. But what we noticed is we hadn't really said what adequate public notice was. And so we just put the charter requirement and how we do it.
And something came up at the Community Economic Development Committee meeting yesterday. The new chair of the zoning commission suggested that we were discussing notice, and there were people from community councils that felt they didn't get enough notice on items. And she suggested that we should include not just snail mail notices, but create electronic notices. And she said Brendan Blob, I believe it is, has got expertise in developing programs like that. And you know, we are in the 21st century. Maybe it's time to include electronic notices as well as snail mail notices.
Well, right, so we say, I think that's what you're saying, but in D1, it's the web page. Because I just asked them, what do we do? And the way we do notice is not nailing it up on a board, right? We say reasonable public notice of a regular assembly meeting shall be accomplished by we probably mean any assembly meeting, but anyway, publication of a written posting of the meeting date, time, and location on the municipal public web page.
But I believe what she was saying is send it out electronically to the community councils and maybe other interested parties.
Okay. We do actually have time for...
Actually, if I could respond, a lot of our code sections actually provide for electronic notice to mailers. So people who are really interested in a particular subject area, pre-signed up for that, they get automatic electronic notice.
But, you know, and this has happened so many times, I could call them all, is you'll be at a meeting and someone will go, oh, I didn't even know this was happening. Why didn't I get notified? And they're all up in arms about this. We're trying to do something under the table without letting people know about it, you know. And then they go ahead and they check the mailing list, and yeah, well, you know, you got the mail notice 3 weeks ago or whatever. And so we're just thinking any way we can try to get the word out in different manners. And so, some people actually look at their snail mail, and some people don't necessarily look at it very closely. And some people get everything on their phone, and so they're more used to getting information on their phone nowadays than through the mail.
Yep, that's very true. Any member of the public that wants to discuss this issue? Anyone at all? Seeing no one, no, Mr. Haberman.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I live in Massachusetts Valley. I follow the public process. When the public process is an appropriate decision, electing public leaders. If I had to sum up what I heard here today, and first of all, discussing issues of process, and I'm not really hearing connecting with the public better. I'm more hearing how you connect to get your agenda through, and not more connected with the public and do that time. And if I just sum up on that issue, that's what I was hearing. Second is, it deeply concerns me. First of all, I came back to picture of 2012 election, so I've been around. There's only one assembly member that's here now that wasn't here then. I mean, that only one assembly member is assembly member training, but goes back to 2012 when I came back to the picture. Everyone else is new. So this is how long I came to that phase, although I go back to George Sullivan days. And back in George Sullivan days, we used to have a published agenda in the newspaper. And I asked you also to have out in the Valley, what if your electronic system doesn't work and you just use the website, like what happened in the Valley? And it was like business as usual, but they do have a published agenda, but what about that information? And they just dealt with a disaster, and they had those meetings with no consideration of the public. And you're not doing that what if for electronic systems working. The other thing is that I should note is time, date, and location of meetings. You don't do a meeting earlier than the time you note. And today's meeting, a few minutes, the 12:31 started at 12:25, and even the chair had said that we're starting early, and you can't do that. Even Barbara Jones would raise concern about that. And then the last thing is, again, whoever's writing this thing, I see some members on this handwriting, and I heard about certain parties here who were involved with putting this thing together, but I just see more of the same, more tragic situation. And I won't say it here today, but some of the members are aware of it, of the comments coming from the president of the school board yesterday and what she thought about connecting the public. And the assembly members told me they cringed at those words. You'll be hearing in the future, next few days, about that incident. But it's more of the same, nothing's changing. And most critical, ask yourself, fewer and fewer people in the public are at those meetings, and they're frustrated. They're frustrated by the way the process is. And on amendments, the last thing on amendments is, what I have to do as a member of the public, I'm so tuned in. Those amendments are not really accessible to the public. It has to be someone like me that knows, watch those members, watch the paper going around you all, and then come to the corner and pick up the amendments. Who in that room from the public knows that? Is that the way you distribute amendments? And that's what you've been doing. And my time is up because of 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Mr. Haverly. Did you want to say something, Mr. Dest?
Yeah, thank you. So I saw you, Mr. Croft, channeling some of Eugene's message, and a very needed and well done effort to get a more public process and slow the process down so the interested people and the observers can get as much information as possible. You did it in a really well way. And Eugene, respectfully, if you missed what was going on here and your predisposition to criticize the project, you missed the point almost completely. And I'm sorry, because you can be a valuable asset to the process. But anyways, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Was there one thing?
You can answer them off by word.